Welcome to This Week's Okay at Work with myself, Sarah Sawyer, my colleague, Berger, both attorneys at Offit Kurman. And today we are talking about those fun little sections in contracts under the miscellaneous section, the legal language that comes kind of towards, often, not always, but often towards the bottom of a contract. You got your commercial terms, like what things are going to cost, how things are going to proceed, what the timelines are, all of those types of practical things often. And then you get down to the things that you've been able to apply in or a business as just kind of legal gobbledygook and things they don't know much about or will rely on counsel for. And sometimes it looks like because they're further down and maybe they're under a clause that says miscellaneous, that they don't matter as much because they're just the legal stuff. Well, down there is a important clause, the indemnification clause. So why should companies be paying attention? Companies, individuals who are contracting, anyone who's in contracting and sees an indemnification clause, regardless of where it is, but especially if it's below a miscellaneous section and they don't want to pay attention to it, why should they be paying attention to that clause, Russell?
Yeah, well, a lot of things in business are about properly balancing, hopefully to your benefit, risk and reward. And an indemnification provision is a risk allocation tool. It shifts risk from one party to the other. And basically, what most of them say is if a third party sues us for X, this party is going to be responsible for indemnifying this other party. And what that means is if we get sued because for these reasons, then the other side's going to pay for my defense, or I'm going to have to pay for the other side's defense. So it's an allocation of who's really responsible for different types of outcomes and different types of risk. So it's critically important that when you have indemnification clauses, at least look at it to make sure that it's limited. You're only indemnifying for things that are within your control and that you ought to be responsible for, or that you're comfortable being responsible for. Flip that the other way. You want to seek indemnification for things where you're not going to be in control, where someone else is going to have the ability to control that outcome. So lots of times you see provisions that say party B will indemnify party A for lawsuits and claims brought by third parties for party B's negligence. And if party A is getting sued because of something party B did, then party B's got to pay the freight. Those are the kinds of provisions that you typically expect to see. But when you start defining them and getting to the weeds of it, you want to make sure that the language is aligned with the actual relationship between A and B.
Yeah, and another thing that happens often here, depending on the dynamics between the parties, is sometimes you might be contracting, you're a smaller business, and you might be contracting with a much larger business who might have very stringent indemnification clauses, ones that are really setting a lot of risk, like putting a lot of risk on you. And so there's different ways to be obviously negotiating those terms and figuring out what's reasonable. And I do find that it's an area where sometimes that 1,000-pound gorilla, that company that's got the resources, will have a really robust indemnity clause. They might take a strong stance on it. And so hopefully you can negotiate it, even if you're not able to negotiate it, though, to your points, Russell, about you're going to accept that risk. Well, know what that risk is, understand how big that risk might be, and maybe find ways to insure around it, or maybe you can make some modifications. Sometimes you can also negotiate to limit your exposure to maybe the value of the contract, certain things like that. So there are tools that even if the indemnification clauses are exposing you to a little bit more risk than you are willing to accept, the key is at least knowing that you're not willing to accept or want to accept, I should say. You might be willing to accept, you don't want to, but that at least you'll know that you're taking on that risk. Because it's terrible when I have a client come to me, they're involved in something where there's an indemnification claim under the contract, and they're like, why am I on the hook for this? And I didn't realize I was on the hook for this. I have to deal with this. Why aren't they dealing with this? Why is this on me? And so you really want to know those things up front, because you don't want to suddenly have that risk come calling and you think that it was never going to come your way.
Yeah. Like anything we've ever talked about when it comes to contracting, think it all the way through. Every word in that contract is in there for a reason. And most non-lawyers aren't going to fully appreciate every sentence that's in a contract, but you should have someone look at it who does and who helps guide your review through that. I think it's really important that, to state the obvious, like, what you're signing and that you're able to exert some influence over changing what you're signing if it's too far out of whack to be tolerable given the business circumstances.
Yeah, despite what some people might perceive, we don't, as lawyers, just put things in there to put them in there to look fancy and look like fun legal language. It's in there for a reason. It's not just boilerplate language. It actually has meaning. So Well, thanks, Russell. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sarah.